Good afternoon. My name is Chrissy Matheson, and I'll be your moderator for today's Cabinet Outs. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce the Premier of Nova Scotia, Stephen McNeil. We'll now take questions from the room.
We're seeing regular reports of people, particularly in HRM, getting turned out of their apartments because they cannot afford to keep living there. Has your government done enough to try to address this issue?
Well, this issue obviously has continued to be ongoing. The rents up have worked for some. We have known, particularly since COVID, we've seen a tremendous pressure being applied by landlords, in essence, to whether they're renovating their units or whatever, that is forcing, particularly in the peninsula and downtown core, people out. I was pleased yesterday to hear the federal government announce $8.7 million for Halifax, and I know that Minister Porter will be working with HRM on what are the other options that we can continue to add to the housing stock around affordability.
You mentioned the rent supplements. In the last 2 years, as you've increased those, the wait list for public housing has gone up 30%. It would suggest that what you're doing so far is not working.
Well, I would say that it's multifaceted. I don't know if I'd be that definitive. Those people who have those rent subs would probably disagree with you. But there's no question there's more work to do. And as I said, I was pleased yesterday to hear the federal government around the announcement 8.7. We'll work with HRM as well as our own and Department of Housing under Minister Porter and see how do we leverage that money to provide different ways, innovative ways, and particularly here, as I said, in the core of HRM.
What has the government your government imposed rent relief or, a rent cap, or since there's been many proposals put forward by the NDP over the years? Rent control or rent cap?
We just have a different. We just don't believe they work. They haven't worked in other places where they've applied, and it's a different philosophical issue. That doesn't mean the issue is not real, and we'll work with our partners to provide other options.
Premier, when people are seeing rent increases of 50%, 70%, in one case, a woman in Fairview's got a 90% rent increase. What solace should these folks be taking in what you're saying when their lived reality is that they are getting priced out of HRM?
Well, there's no question. There's no question there are some people that are being priced out of HRM, and some landlords have, in my view, taken advantage of the opportunity to be able to come in, redo their housing options, as they call them, renovate, and then re-rent them at a much larger amount. But as I said to you, we were pleased yesterday that the federal government will join us in this journey. Minister Porter will work with his colleagues here in HRM to provide options.
I guess what I'm trying to get at
is going to translate into fewer than 50 units. We had more evictions in the last week alone on that. How can we see more public money going into housing?
So as I said, we'll look at what are the options with that $8.7 million. How do we leverage some also municipal but provincial money that we can actually compound that to provide other alternatives?
There's more funding than that 8.7 available for more project-specific options for municipalities and provinces. What's the government's strategy to go after some other parts of that pie?
So it just came out yesterday. The minister will be looking at all of that, but what you're highlighting there is the real opportunity out of that for us to be able to leverage municipal money as well as our own, to be able to expand on that number of 8.7 to deal with this obviously very serious and growing issue here in HRM.
But I guess what I'm having a hard time understanding here is you're acknowledging that there's a problem here, particularly with certain landlords and their approach. Clearly more needs to be done. If there's a demonstrable problem and the government is aware of it, doesn't it have an onus to step in and take a more direct path to addressing that problem?
So we do, and once we have the right public policy, we'll communicate it to you. We're still working on the solution. I don't think if I can, without the appropriate public policy lens, with all of our partners working together to look at that, that we come up with the right solution. You've obviously highlighted very here, you obviously don't believe rent subs are working. They are for certain people, but there's other situations that's not the case, where we have to then put with all of our other partners to provide a different public policy lens on what that looks like. And as I said, Minister Porter and his team will be doing that.
Premier, it's not about what I believe. At a time when your government has increased rent supplements, the wait list for public housing has also increased by 30% in the last 2 years alone. And so it would seem then that it would behoove the government to look at alternatives. But just to pick up on your point about policy, this situation isn't new. It's been brought to the government's attention for years. Why is it taking so long to get policy in place?
I think if housing policy was as simplistic as you're making it out to be, it would have been solved.
Sir, but
It
the
would have been
suggestion
solved.
from advocates has
Would have
been
been
that the government
solved.
has dragged its feet in addressing this issue.
It would have been solved successive governments ago. We've continued to work, and as I said, we'll continue to provide policy options and work with our partners to deal with the issue.
Do you have an understanding for why this situation is unfolding and getting worse? I mean, it's orders of magnitude different than 5 years ago.
So I think one of the actual, this is one of the consequences of the successive growth of our economy and population. The demand here has been no question. People have come into this province. We've seen a record population, 40,000 new Nova Scotians. We've seen the investment in properties. You can see the cost of property is going through the roof, the cost of rent that people are paying. Obviously, landlords are trying to capitalize on that as well. So
Well, clearly, if you're going to point to the growth of the economy and whatever, there is a distribution problem and an inequality problem.
listen, we're not disagreeing. We're not disagreeing, but we can't on one hand say that the issue, that's one of the issues with growth. Clearly, we need to do more around affordability and affordable housing, and particularly in the core. There's no question. That takes all levels of government to be working together, and Minister Porter will continue to work on that.
Sorry, happy to go back to that. I just want to make sure I get a question in for my colleague. Chief Terry Paul stepped down, obviously, as co-chair of the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs. I wonder if that's going to impact any negotiation or relationship the province has ongoing currently, and just, what your updated sense is of the fisheries dispute right now.
First of all, I don't see it being causing major issues with us, the province. We continue to work not only with Member 2, but all chiefs across the province. I think it highlights when you're dealing with these policy issues, if you're trying to solve them one community at a time, you create this kind of situation where Chief Terry felt it was better to step away and negotiate on behalf of Member 2. We have a tripartite approach here in Nova Scotia, which started back, I think it's back as far as Dr. Savage, and gone through all governments. It's had its ups and downs. Sabag-and-Agady is outside of that. Moment in time, Millbrook was as well. I think they're back in. This particular issue, though, has caused issues, and I think it highlights that if you try to solve a nation issue by a community, by negotiating with one community, you cause that fraction. And in this case, Chief Terry has felt, I think it's better for him to try to solve this on behalf of Member 2 outside the Assembly. To solve this for Member 2 outside of the Assembly. No, tripartite, which is all, tripartite. It was all three levels, of provincial, federal, and the Mi'kmaq.
Premier, you were talking about considering policy options to ensure there's more affordable housing in the province. Can you talk about what those options are?
No, Minister Porter will be dealing with that, and when we have those, we'll communicate them to you.
Have you made a decision yet about recalling the legislature?
No, not yet, but I'm getting pretty close.
Is it your expectation that when you do it, that your government will have legislation to table?
Every department now is putting legislation through now. There's stuff that's coming in around policy, which is some of it has been dealing with. So we have I think I've probably seen 10, 12 pieces of legislation.
Natasha?
Sorry. Thank you. I'm just wondering, obviously the current, the justice overseeing that yesterday said the current facility, of course, is not adequate with COVID to continue hearing evidence in the inquiry, which means another delay. Are you concerned about how many delays this inquiry is seeing and how that could ultimately affect the outcome?
Obviously, it's an independent inquiry, but obviously the concerns that were raised yesterday about space and all of that, certainly they're an issue, and we'll work with the Commissioner to find space that make sense. I think would be important for everyone involved in the inquiry that the commissioner and is allowed to do the work in a way that's safe in this new COVID environment, and allowing us to get the result for that family.
Premier, you had said back in 2019 that you wanted to solve the teachers' pension issue. I'm just wondering, you know, you're getting down the last few months in office. Do you expect that's something you're going to be able to do? I'm sure in 2019 you didn't know when you'd be leaving.
I don't know how to answer that. We outside of the collective agreement, we have reached an agreement with the NSTU that we would have independent committee of actuaries, pension specialists, who would look at their pension. I think there's a 3-person committee. They have to be announced January 8th, I believe it is, and report back with recommendations by August 31st. And that they have direct access to teachers across this province to communicate to them the challenges with their pension plan and bring back solutions to be able to solve it.
So I just want to make sure I understand. Those are dates coming up. Those are because I haven't heard about that.
No,
before.
that's right. Yeah.
There was a consultant that was hired. I think it was last year, and she was looking at the pension issue. Was that? I believe she was hired by the board. I forget her name. I'm sorry, I don't have it.
I'm not sure I know the details. This is something that's been agreed upon outside of the collective bargaining process, and it is that you know these will be pension specialists, which will delve into the issues of the unfunded liability and what are some strategies on a go-forward basis. And the important part for us is that they will be able to go directly talk to teachers who, quite frankly, may have some positive solutions for them on how you deal with it. You know, many of them who have been involved either with the union or on committees would have you know, some expertise in and around that pension plan, and it's important for rank and file teachers to understand the complexity of this plan and the vulnerability of it.
Gonna go to the phones now.
Be part of that process, part of the consultation.
I'm not 100% sure on that.
Watching my time, I'm going to go to the phones, and we'll go to Keith Doucette with the Canadian Press.
Good morning, Premier.
Morning, Keith.
Chief Mike Sack has continuously called for the idea of a licensing exemption for their livelihood fishery. I'm just wondering what you think of that idea and whether the province is considering that as part of the overall negotiations on the fishery.
Our licenses are built on federal policy in and around fishing seasons, and until there's been an agreement on what that moderate livelihood fishery looks like, there will be no adjustments in our policy around licensing buyers.
Go ahead with your follow-up, Keith.
So there are no talks currently around this issue, and would you entertain such talks if you get the conditions that you want?
No, and if I do, I'll be talking directly to the Mi'kmaq, the assembly, not individual chiefs. I'll be talking directly to the assembly on any issues that may be impacted, but it won't be solved community by community.
Next, we'll go to Steve Go with News 95.7.
Hi there. Just a quick question. We continue to hear from a number of parents who are frustrated they can't watch their kids play hockey while crowds can gather at Scotiabank Centre to watch the Mooseheads. You know, in Prince Edward Island, rinks have adopted protocols to allow parents. I'm just curious where the province is at, or is a similar plan or a timeline to ensure that rinks are open for parents?
Well, that would be a decision by public health. Public health sets the policy in and around that.
Steve, go ahead with your follow-up.
Touching on the homelessness issue, you know, there's been reports of an encampment in Long Lake Provincial Park. You know, Shelter Nova Scotia says there's demand for housing has been dramatically increased with over 200 calls for men's shelter. What plans does Nova Scotia have to address the growing need of housing or support for emergency shelters, I guess, heading into the second wave this winter?
Well, Minister Porter would be better to answer that question for you, but we'll continue to provide options. As you know, you are right, we're heading into the winter months. This is always a more challenging time, and then on top of that, adding the issue of COVID and the issue that's been raised here by many around the rent issue. We recognize could be a year that there will be tremendous pressure put on those shelters, and the Minister will continue to work with our partners out in the community to provide those options.
Next question will go to Jean Laroche with CBC.
Good afternoon, Premier. I wondered if, to follow up on what my colleagues have been asking, you say that people can expect a policy decision on the housing and rent, well, obviously not rent control because you're not a fan of that. When can people expect some sort of change in policy to be able to help them stay in their homes?
I don't have a direct timeline on that. We'll continue to work with our partners, as I said early on, to provide those options.
Go ahead with your follow-up, Jean.
You have taken the position that non-native fishermen need to be at the table for talks between the Mi'kmaq and Ottawa. That runs counter what the Mi'kmaq and Ottawa want. It also runs counter to the notion of nation-to-nation talks. As Aboriginal Affairs Minister, Premier, why have you taken that position? Well,
First of all, it is an issue of the question of rights is no longer a question. It's already been settled. The Supreme Court settled the issue that the Mi'kmaq Nation have a right to a moderate livelihood. What it also said was that the federal government has the responsibility around conservation to ensure that it's integrated into a commercial fishery. That includes the commercial fishermen. So to me, the way to find the right solution to this is to have everyone at the table. And as Grand Chief Norman Syllaboy would say, this cannot be solved one community at a time. It should be with, in our case, the Assembly should be at that table on behalf of all Mi'kmaq communities. You would also fully understand that this issue is really beyond just Nova Scotia. If you go back historically, the Mi'kmaq was, when 1604, when the French arrived, that included New Brunswick, PEI, Newfoundland, part of Maine. So the issue that we're going to solve this by dealing with one community in Nova Scotia without including all other communities, which would mean the Assembly here and connections beyond, and then people representing the fishery. Again, the right has already been decided. What the court also said, though, is the federal government has a responsibility to integrate it into our commercial fishery and the fishery that currently exists, to regulate it, to manage it. And it's my belief that all participants in that fishery should be at the table as we talk about it.
Next question will go to Lindsay Armstrong with All Nova Scotia.
Thank you. Mr. Premier, local company Sixth Wave has been awarded $250,000 for its COVID-detecting polymer from your Dell-led COVID-19 Response Council, which came from Special Pandemic Supplies Innovation Fund, which I've been told by the Department of Business was launched in May. Was this fund ever publicly announced?
I'm not sure what it is you're referring to be honest with you. I can tell you that the funding that was announced at Dal has been announced. I announced it in two different sessions, $50 million each at different times.
Yes, and from that funding, earlier this week it was announced that Sixth Wave received $250,000 from this Nova Scotian COVID-19 Response Council. And I've been told from your Department of Business that it came from a Special Pandemic Supplies Innovation Fund, which I have never heard of. I'm looking for information about this fund and why this company got $250,000. I'm
sure the Minister would be able to provide the details of it with you. I know that we had a number of funds that were with DAL in trust, with parameters around them to respond to COVID. Some of it was going out in direct support to companies, and obviously some of it is being used in how do we have technology to deal with the issue. But I'm sure he'll be able to provide that with you.
That's all the time that we have for questions today. Thank you, Premier.
Thanks very much.